Perfect. Well, welcome to the UCLI team, Professor Dr. Daniels. What's the best thing that we should be calling you today?
You can call me Brig.
Okay, Brig. Sounds good. Well, just to introduce myself, I'm Casey Sorensen. I'm the Associate Director here at UCLI. We've got a team of interns here. Today we've got 6 on the call. Well, sorry, 5, and Layla, who's our administrative coordinator, and then a couple who weren't able to make it today. We have done these weekly meetings most weeks during their internship. We've been able to interact with a bunch of different attorneys and people from different professional backgrounds, professional legal backgrounds. So we're super excited to have you today. Would you just take a couple of seconds and introduce yourself?
Sure. So as I mentioned, my name's Brigham or Brig. I am a professor at BYU Law School. I live in Provo. I have a dog whose name's Bruno, and you might hear him panting. He's not very far away from me, actually. I have 3 kids. My oldest daughter lives in New York City, and my son's a student at the University of Utah. And then I have another daughter who's in public school still. My wife and I both work at BYU, and we're just like within a short walk of campus, and we frequently walk together. I'll even walk over there with her and walk home if I'll walk the dog with her, walk her to work sometimes if she's going before me. But that's a little bit of a nutshell of our life, who I am, at least kind of the major things.
Sounds like a cozy life that you're leading.
Yeah, boring life. Cozy is another word for it. Yeah.
I think it sounds nice.
It's nice.
Well, thanks for introducing yourself a bit. I sent you a handful of the questions that actually most of the questions that the interns asked, just about your experience in environmental law and academia, and just kind of more general questions. Is there any place that you'd like to start? Would you prefer kind of going through all the questions, or just kind of talking?
Well, we can go through some of the questions, and maybe you should keep your eye on the next question you think I should answer. But a lot of the questions, and they're very thoughtful questions, by the way. I was impressed with the questions. They seemed very thoughtful. Mm-hmm. But a lot of that, it kind of dealt with, why did I choose environmental law? And then what does an environmental lawyer do? And maybe I can answer both of those questions before we start. And then, maybe we could drill down a little bit. So I didn't think about it this way when I was of that age, where I was choosing what I was to do. But I have a very smart friend who was talking to me a while ago about how he counsels students. His name's Quinn Meekum. And Quinn told me, he said, look, if a student doesn't know what they want to do, the first question I might ask them is, what sorts of problems do you want to try to solve? What is a problem that really speaks to you? And for me, I knew the problem I was interested in. I changed my major like 20 times as an undergrad, but it's because they didn't have an environmental science or an environmental studies major at the University of Utah when I was in school. But yeah, I was basically trying to do that, right? I mainly stayed on the social science and humanities side of things, but I had thought, I had looked at the major for biology and chemistry and other things closely enough to know like what the requirements were and what the classes were. But like when I would change my major, it was always like, if I was going to do, ultimately I did economics, and it was environmental economics. And I got a scholarship when I was in school from the philosophy department because I was interested in environmental ethics, and they took it away when I changed my major. But I just kind of went. I was interested in environmental politics. I was interested in just how the environment worked. I knew for sure that was what I wanted to do. I didn't know. So the second question that my friend brought up to kind of help students think through problems, I didn't have a good answer to this question. And that was, what kinds of work do you want to do? How do you want to engage with work? Right. And I mean, I really like people. I really, I don't mind like crunchy numbers. I like spreadsheets. I like to write. I like to persuade people to do things. I am, generally speaking, conflict adverse, although I have something in me that, like, when it like clicks, like I am like I can just, my wife Kelly, she calls it lawyer Brigham. When lawyer Brigham's around, I'm very much conflict seeking, and I don't mind taking people out. But I don't know. I didn't know really what I wanted to do like that way. I had so many different kinds of things. And I think one of the reasons I changed my major so many times is because I was really trying to figure out, like, how do I want to engage with the world? Like, what kind of tools do I want to bring to it? But so I knew I was going to do something in environment. The idea that I would do something in law came quite a bit later. And but I knew for sure, I knew from the minute I applied to today that what I do is environmental law. If I was going to do the law, that's what I was going to do. So that's kind of how I chose it. But I still had this problem of how do I want to engage with the world even after law school? I mean, I had the tools to be a lawyer, and I had a job at a firm. One of the things that I've realized about myself is that I get unhappy in a job if I don't really feel like I'm doing something significant for, like, the world. Like, it's not just enough to do a good job for a client. I have to feel like somehow the world is a better place because I'm working. And even in my current job, if I get frustrated, a lot of times that is the nexus of it, is that I haven't spent enough time doing pro bono work or working on real projects, and something like that. But so I did kind of flounder around a little bit, and ultimately I decided that I really love engaging with people, and I like teaching. And I then decided I wanted to be a law school professor. And to become a law school professor, what it really means is you have to have a research agenda, and you have to have a bunch of articles that you've written or are writing. And I couldn't figure out a way to do that as a practicing lawyer. And so that's why I decided to get a PhD after law school. So in order just to give me a few years to just really focus on that and get it squared away. Had it been my focus all along, I wouldn't have had to get the PhD. Although I enjoyed getting the PhD, I wouldn't have had to do it. So let me just answer the question of what is it like to be an environmental lawyer. And I can say, so first of all, it's a lot of times it's not what you think it is, or at least, one of the challenges of being an environmental lawyer is that trees and rivers and forests aren't really good at paying their bills. So what you have to do is you have to find people who are willing to pay the bills. And so what that might mean is you know, if you really care a lot about like trying to make a positive difference in the world, you might be somewhat skeptical of the people who are willing to pay a lot of money for environmental lawyers, right? I mean, there's different levels of money, right? When I'm talking about a lot of money, I'm talking about these are mining companies, oil companies, right? I mean, basically the polluters, the environmental problem causers are the people who want to pay a lot of money to environmental lawyers. You also have a lot of jobs in the government. And I mean, there are federal jobs, you know, with the various agencies, whether it's a Forest Service or the EPA or Fish and Wildlife or whatever. But I mean, most of the jobs that are out there are actually at the state level or even the county and city level. I mean, they're they might not even think of themselves as strictly environmental lawyers, but a lot of the lawyers in small towns, they are trying to basically solve environmental problems, right? A neighbor complaining that the industry next door puts out too much pollution. They have to figure out what to do about it because the neighbors are all upset, right? So there's a lot of jobs in the government. And there are nonprofit jobs. What I will say about the nonprofit sector generally is it's not nearly robust in any field as you would hope it is, right? In almost every field, there are people who are working for nonprofit organizations, but they typically have, you know, they're just completely outmatched as far as how many problems there are in the world. So those are hard to get. Now, what I will say is, you know, and then there's, you know, of course, environmental teaching and being a professor, right? I mean, that's true too. What I'll say is working as an environmental lawyer is more, I had a very strong preference when I was applying to law school that I would never work for a law firm because I didn't really like the clients that a lot of the law firms had. And one of the pressures I had as a young attorney is that's where I really felt like I was going to get the best training because they had the most resources to train people. And so you kind of had to decide, you know, whether or not you wanted to go to a place where you're just going to be given a bunch of files and just told to do the job, or you're going to get a smaller number of files and you have senior attorneys who will work with you and teach you how the job is done. And I chose the latter. The thing that was surprising to me, and I just kind of thought I would do this for a few years and then try something new, and that's what I did do. In fact, that's when I went to go get my PhD. But I thought I was going to probably take a different direction. At that time I was meeting with a lot of the environmental organizations and thinking I was going to make a lateral move kind of that way. But one of the things that is surprising is environmental law is, someone asked, is it mainly litigation or is it transactional work? What is it like? It can be all of the above, but if you work for a big law firm, a big chunk of it is what I would call compliance work. So it's kind of, it might seem counterintuitive, but people at law firms who work for big companies spend a lot of time making sure that the clients that they work for comply with the law. And that's similar to what the EPA does. The difference is you're trying to convince the client to do different things before they get into legal trouble. Does that make sense? Basically show them where the limits are. And basically say, look, here is the limit. And let's strategize with your engineers, and the engineers will come up with 4 different problems with 5 different, different cost parameters. And then you say, look, of these 4, the most risky is A and the least risky is C. You've got to make a decision. And, you kind of looking ahead, the EPA has continually made these regulations more demanding. There's maybe some reasons to do C, even if you don't want to be risk adverse, just to buy yourself a solution to the problem for a longer time period or whatever. And so a lot of what you do in a law firm is actually, you know, what I didn't do a lot of this work, but there was a guy in my law firm who did almost all of his work was with Chevron. And if you were to ask him what his job was, and he detailed what he did every day, you'd think he worked for the Sierra Club. I mean, it's kind of a strange thing, because what he's trying to do is get Chevron to be a better environmental actor every day. But then when this guy goes out to, to dinner parties or whatever, he tries to avoid telling people he works for a big oil company or something, because they think he's, a sellout. And in some ways, whatever. So it's kind of complicated. I've done a lot of litigation work. That kind of work I have done. I will tell you, as an environmental lawyer, what an interesting thing. I've really only felt bad. I felt bad about some of the results I've gotten for clients or failed to get for clients. But the only time that I felt bad actually doing the thing, so not necessarily the result, but like, did I feel like a bad person, was I was working for a law firm. I took a year off of law school to work on a project that I was passionate about, trying to stop a highway, or move a highway at least, called the Legacy Highway. It's now built in Salt Lake but originally it was going to be built over part of the Great Salt Lake. And I really wanted to, it really made me angry as a young person. And I took a year off I worked my very first summer for the Sierra Club. And it was kind of funny, because I had a job offer from a law firm where they were going to pay me a lot of money in the summer. And I turned it down to work for the Sierra Club. And then, like 1.5 weeks into my internship with the Sierra Club, this law firm took on the case for free, pro bono. And so I ended up going to the law firm every day, and I didn't get paid. So it was it was kind of a real peculiar thing. But at any rate, I ended up taking a year off of law school to work on this case, and we actually got an injunction, meaning that for at least a moment, they paused. They started to build the highway, and they stopped building the highway. And here is the reason I felt so bad. One of the things that the state had gambled on is that the judge would be less likely to stop the highway if it meant that they were going to have to fire a lot of people. So they knew they had a very short time window to get people working before we would try to get an injunction. And they hired like a few hundred people to start working the week of Thanksgiving. And we got the injunction like the weekend of Thanksgiving. And construction jobs are really hard to get in the winter, and they're good paying jobs. And, I just think, I just remember feeling so terrible that all of these construction workers, I was just kind of thinking about what, their holiday season was going to be like, and what it would have felt like to be a member of those families. And I just felt really bad. I felt really, really bad. But that's the only time I've really ever felt guilty working as an environmental attorney. The other thing that I've done a lot of is I give policymakers advice about how to sculpt laws. Like, how do you make a law that solves a certain kind of problem? That is something that I did that as a practitioner, but that is more and more the kind of work that I seek out as a law professor. So my current kind of set of problems that I'm interested in working on, and I do work on, is with national parks. And I've helped some national parks here in Utah, and I also have been working for about 7 or 8 years helping a national park in Uganda, which is kind of a long story that I could tell you, but I don't know if that's really our priority, but at any rate, so I mean, that's another thing that lawyers do, is figure out how do you make rules that will come to certain outcomes. And for environmental law, someone asked, what is environmental law like? I mean, they were meaning like, what kinds of laws are they? A lot of them are regulation and rules that are written, or laws that are written. And so, and instead of like common law, and so judge-made law. And so what I end up doing is helping figure out what those rules ought to look like. I'll open it. You can think about what the next question is, Casey, but I'll just say I'm happy to talk about all of these things. I've worked for projects for the government before, at the federal, state, and local levels. I have sued every one of those levels of government. I have worked for corporations. I have sued them. I have worked for nonprofits. I am looking for an opportunity to sue a nonprofit so I could really just finish that loop. I've never yet sued it. I've never sued a nonprofit yet, so that's still on my to-do list. But I mean, I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about whatever you all are interested in. And if there's a question, Casey, that you think would be important for me to answer, I'd be happy to talk about it.
I have a question that's just kind of come up hearing you speak, if that's all right.
Yeah.
One thing that, and I feel like I asked something like this in a lot of our conversations, but one thing I hear from you, and I remember hearing from you also as a professor, is just empathy. And I feel like from the outside, it's not always easy to see the empathy lawyers do or do not have. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah.
Do you feel like, I mean, if there's only one example in your entire career where you're like, you feel badly about the outcome, do you feel like there are certain kinds of law where, I don't know, where there are more opportunities to feel kind of bad about the outcomes, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
And are there kinds of law where it is just kind of like enforcing rules and regulations where you're not like necessarily personally affected by?
I'm not saying we're not personally affected. I am personally affected a lot. It's just, I didn't feel bad about representing my client, right? Like where I feel bad is when I get a result that is not what I wanted. And it isn't because I just lost. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I do because I care about the problem and I care about the client. And so when I lose, I really feel bad. I mean, I went through this just a few weeks ago. So I mainly do environmental law. I also am I do what they call land use law, which is kind of local environmental law is how I think about it. But I also do property law, which is very much related to environmental law. And I have been fighting on behalf of students who were ill-treated by their landlords during COVID over payments with the rent. I've probably helped, I don't know, I probably represented 20 students total. And I went to, they had a mediator set up. I probably went to the mediator to mediate conflict probably a dozen times for students. And I was successful most of the times, but there was they were brothers who I had helped. This is just one example. I have a more recent example too, where I didn't get the result I wanted, but I had a set of brothers who found out right about the time that COVID hit that their mother had she had been abused by their stepfather, and just sort of the idea of being locked down with this guy was a lot, and conflict erupted, and she ended up being homeless for a week or so, right at the very beginning of COVID. And this coincided with when BYU shut down its classes. And these brothers left BYU in the middle of the semester, not knowing what was going to happen, to go help her. And I took on their case. And, I had won a bunch of cases for students who had mental illnesses, or they were asthmatics or whatever. But this one, the mediator was just like, well, the provision of the lease that really could get them out, which really deals with COVID. Although I feel bad for these boys, I'm using his words. He's an older dude. He's a retired judge, like 70s. I feel bad for these boys, but I don't feel like they left due to COVID. And they left because other reasons, and they, bad things happen and not everything's covered by the lease. Sorry, you guys lose. And I remember talking to these two afterwards, and they had just had such a terrible semester and such a terrible challenge and so on and so forth. And the thing I was doing wasn't really a big part of their problem. I mean, it was part of their problem, but it wasn't. But I took it on because I really cared about them and their story, and I wanted to make a positive difference. And I hated losing that one. I hated losing that one. And I do think that there are areas of the law that are much more kind of arm's length than other things. Environmental law tends to be a little bit more arm's length than like landlord-tenant disputes. But I think it's interesting. You kind of have to figure out how much you want to get into it, into people's personal lives, and how much there are lawyers who really feed on this, and there are lawyers who are really adverse to it. But there are all sorts of kinds of practices where you're dealing really with very, very closely with people's future. So I think immigration law is one of them. Family law is another one. Actually, personal injury law is another one. And if it's really, really hard for you to lose, when you really care about the client's well-being, you're going to lose no matter who you are. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. And so, that you just have to live with the fact that you will lose some. And on the other hand, for the people who really do this kind of work and really thrive on it, it is very, very satisfying when somebody who really needs help, that you're the person that can do it, right? They had a problem, they couldn't figure it out, and all of a sudden you figured it out for them. And it's there is something really magical about that. It really is very, very satisfying when that happens. So, I think it kind of depends on kind of what your what your tolerance is for this kind of thing. But I do think, there are more kinds of laws that are more, when you start dealing with policy, which is what I mainly deal with, it's how do you sculpt a law that gets you the result that you want? You're thinking about not just a particular case, but the whole, here's basically how people are going to interact with that rule. And here, you kind of think at more kind of a bigger kind of macro level, and you don't feel as personal with those things, even if the client doesn't adopt it. I mean, it is a little bit more arm's length. But on the other hand, one of the things I really like about that kind of work is you can make a big difference, right? Like you can make a difference in 1,000 cases if you get the right rule, right? Whereas if you're doing just one at a time, it's a lot harder to make big headway. So any rate.
So how do you get involved in policy making then? Like there's not a focus where you can be like, I want to be a policy lawyer, unless there is, I don't know.
There is.
How do you get involved with that?
There is. I mean, so every government entity has lawyers that do this. So the most formal one that we could kind of think about is how the federal government splits up its work. Okay. Every litigation in the United States is handled by the Justice Department, right? So there may be people who work for an agency, let's call it Federal Highway Administration or for the U.S. Forest Service, that are kind of helping with litigation, but they don't actually ever make an argument. They can maybe sit at the table, but they never stand up and say, hello, my name is so-and-so and I represent the United States, right? They're just there to help provide kind of support. But most of the lawyers who work for agencies are not dealing with litigation, right? What they are actually dealing with is legal problems. And so, within an agency, I did some consulting work a while ago for the Department of Interior, and it's basically a bunch of lawyers who end up purchasing property from people when the federal government needs to take property in order to do federal projects, right? And I was basically just giving them a training about like, how do you structure these kinds of deals and how do you make people more satisfied, less likely to sue you with these kinds of deals. And so there's like this transactional kind of side to a lot of agencies. And, there's this litigation side that helps the Justice Department, but a big chunk of what agencies actually do is figure out like, are we in compliance with the rules, right? So at the most local level, if you work for the Forest Service in Utah, you're not the one making the rules, but you might say, here's the set of rules, and here making sure that we ourselves comply with these rules and that others comply with these rules. And then you have people who in Washington, D.C. actually make the rules. And there will, the rule makers will tend to be one of three types of people. A really small echelon of people who are in leadership. They may or may not be lawyers. People with a scientific background that they're kind of, if science is an important part of understanding it, that they need kind of scientists who could communicate with policy writers or policy makers. And then you have people who actually make the rules. Mm-hmm. And every agency does this. I don't have a copy of it here. I'm at my home, but there's something called the Federal Register. The Federal Register is probably the most boring publication that comes out on a daily basis anywhere in the world. And what the Federal Register is basically draft rules from all of the various agencies and explanations of why these rules are the rules. And people can comment on them. And every day, there's a 100-page document that like, here are the rules that came out today. And lawyers are the ones who wrote those rules by far and large. I mean, there might be some policymakers who got to tweak them on the edges and some scientists who say, well, this is basically the basis for this, but the lawyers are the ones who really write these. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of work for lawyers in actually figuring out what the rules are. Mm-hmm. It just tends not to be, there's not like it's hard to make a drama about writing the rule. So it's just not how lawyers are focused on, but a lot of lawyers who work for the government, especially in Washington, D.C., that's what they do.
Mm-hmm. So So this is kind of going to one of the questions that we sent, but does environmental activism then play a role in your work beyond policy making? And does that work make you more hopeful or cynical? What's the role that that's played in your career?
I do a lot of stuff for environmental activism is something that's important to me. I have represented a lot of environmental groups for free when they are suing people about things that I agree with. In a lot of those cases, not all those cases, but in a lot of those cases, I don't think the organizations would have been able to actually do what they did without my work.
Oh, we lost your video. Oh, and we lost him. What a cliffhanger. Lizzie, would you care to sing while we wait? Oh. There you are. Lost you for a second. We can't hear you. Oh, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hold on. Okay, sorry. Is this better?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's going on, but it is very, very quiet on your end. I'll have to really listen carefully when you talk, but if you can hear me, I'll just continue.
Yeah.
So I was just saying that a lot of this work wouldn't have been able to be done without me, or at least as well, I think, because it's hard to find an attorney to do this. I also have been on various boards of nonprofit organizations. I'm currently working with a Mormon group called LDS Earth Stewardship, which is an environmental group that's focused on getting Mormons to be more environmental. I have been on the board of the Utah Sierra Club. I've done a lot of volunteer work. My favorite nonprofit in Utah is called the Nature Conservancy, and I've done a lot of work for them, and I love working with them. I helped found some organizations that do stuff. There's a new group in Utah County called Conserve Utah Valley that like a half dozen people from Utah County helped start. And I've been heading up a project to preserve a local landmark called Brigham Falls. That's been I've been working on that since December or so. So I don't know if that work makes me more hopeful or cynical. I don't know. I mean, what I'll say is I think I can make a difference, and that is satisfying. There's a lot of problems in the world, and it's easy to feel kind of beaten up by that a little bit, but I really do feel like I mean, one of the things that's interesting about being an environmental lawyer is if you look at sort of the trajectory of where we've gone as a country and a world, is there are a lot of stories that kind of feel like we'd completely blown it, right? And yet somebody figured out a way around it. You know, I mean, you think about like the most cataclysmic environmental thing that I think is in our past is the Dust Bowl, right? People just completely screwed up all the farmlands. And basically everything that was farms all of a sudden is just like dust storms and death and desolation. And, you know, we figured out how to get past that. We figured out how to get past so many environmental problems. And do we have a lot of them? Absolutely. Are we failing a lot of cases? Yeah. But I just feel like I'm not I don't know if I feel cynical or hopeful, but the thing I do feel is determined. I feel like the stakes are high, and I think we still have a chance. And so I really push because I feel like we have a chance.
That's awesome. That's a great response. So our next question kind of is more about your experience as a professor. How has teaching law changed your perception of the legal field?
Sorry, I had to bring my phone
No
up.
worries.
So one thing is my computer wasn't working either this morning, so I'm sorry I'm on my phone. But
Technology is not on
how
the
has
team today.
teaching law changed my perception of the law? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Well, I think the one thing that teaching law does, and you know, teaching law is very different than teaching a lot of things, because I think that a big part of what a lot of my colleagues do around the country, I think a lot of them still actually practice law in one way or another. But one of the things that teaching law has kind of helped me do is figure out unexpected connections and sort of pathways to solve kinds of problems. I mean, the point of it is that when you practice law, what you really do is you work really, really, really hard on a case. And environmental law cases can take a long time. You'll remember I told you I took a year off of law school to work on one case, right? That case is basically distilled down into a couple of published opinions. And, you know, a judge heard those cases in both, a district court judge heard those cases over a period of a day and a half. And the appeals court heard these cases in a period of an hour. So, you know, I mean, what a lot of lawyers work on, they really get into the weeds, and then the output is distilled down to something a lot more accessible. And one of the things that law professors are asked to do is to look at a lot of distilled things. And I mean, the other thing about it is I'm also asked to interact with other law school professors who might teach criminal law, or they might teach contracts or whatever, right? And I look at their ideas about things, and, you know, I end up finding like really, you know, unusual, just because I'm dealing with such distilled things, and my colleagues are, I end up seeing connections with things that just you wouldn't really ever put together. It's just sort of a little bit is happenstance, and some of it is you know, purposeful. But I just think, you know, you start seeing connections that are harder to see. And I think that one of the advantages, I mean, that's one of the real benefits, and particularly if you're somebody who is action oriented, and, you know, it's one thing just to learn this thing. I often try to figure out, can I use this thing to somehow cause trouble or do good in various contexts? And so to me, that it is really quite rewarding. I will say, how I think about the law, and this is probably not a good thing for a professor to say. I mean, I don't know this, how my colleagues would. I don't think the most important thing I do is ideas, though. I mean, I think the most important thing I do is interact with students. And that part of my job does make me hopeful. That is actually one of the most hopeful things in my life, is interacting with young people and Seeing how these, young adults at the very beginning of their trajectory, just like what potential they have. I mean, it's just, to me, that is very, to me, that is probably the core part of being a professor. I mean, I'm telling you probably more than I should. I mean, for me anyway, I end up writing papers just to include, to give a student an experience. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, if I have a shared interest with a research assistant, for example, and I feel like we could write together on this, even if it isn't necessarily my first choice of ideas, if I find a shared space and I feel like the student can carry his share of the way, I will often try to manufacture some way for us to work together. And I love that. And that's, so, I mean, that when I start thinking about some of the ideas that I work on, some of it, not all of it, but, a chunk of what I do is really directed by things like that too, which I really don't have a lot of control over.
So I actually have one of my buddies was a research assistant of yours, Josh Davis, and he's kind of who started my conversation about law school with me. One of the questions that one of our interns has is about students. What have you noticed that sets students apart from each other, whether that's like successfully, like this is what a really strong student demonstrates, or the opposite, like this is kind of where I see students struggle the most? How can you speak to your kind of perspective on student performance in that way?
Yeah. First of all, I'm glad you mentioned Josh. I love Josh Davis. What are things, I'm sorry that I have to put my phone up to basically my enormous head in order to get to actually hear the questions. I'm sorry, but I don't know what's going on with my phone. Do you mind if I just walk up and get my headphones? This might help.
Oh, go ahead.
So what sets students apart? This is a pretty hard question, to be honest with you. Shoot, I don't see them here. What sets the student apart is a pretty hard question, and it is actually one of the most common questions that I end up getting from students after grades come out, right? They want to know, why did I do well? Why did I not do well? And one thing I'll say about, oh my goodness, after walking all the way around, my headphones were just right here. Hold on one second. One of the things about students is, let's see, does this work? Let's see. Can you hear me? Hold on. Let's see. Hold on. Can you hear me now? All right, let's try this one more time.
Perfect.
Okay. I don't think my headphones are working, but I'm going to keep these in for 1 second. It just keeps on repeating over and over that's connecting to my phone. One of the things that I have found is, at least I've taught classes as an adjunct. I taught at the University of Utah. I taught during my PhD program at Duke Law School. I taught at the University of Houston, and now I'm teaching at BYU. And in every one of those cases, what I'll say is, in law school anyway, and I don't know how it is otherwise, but in law school, the average student is really smart. It's not the case that if someone gets an average grade in a law school class, what I would read that to communicate is that person's pretty well. Um, so what really sets a student apart as far as the grades go is, I mean, it's various versions of good, and you have to really compare one against the other, against the other, against the other, and it's extremely hard to grade law school students, because at least at most places they're on a mandatory curve or something like that. So that's a challenge. What I would say, though, is the thing that really separates students, at least in test performance, and this isn't necessarily true about, there's different kinds of smart, right? I mean, you might be really bad at tests, but you still might be that doesn't mean you're going to be a good lawyer or a bad lawyer. It just means you're good at tests, right? I mean, but I think as far as a good test goes, what you really want to do is find people who know the law really well, and then figure out how to connect the law with whatever factual scenario you give them quickly, right? And this is one of the, most of the tests are 3-hour time tests or 4-hour time tests, and it may be that if we had 20-hour time tests or 4-day time tests, you would get a different ordering. So I do think that there is some, you kind of have to practice so you get kind of quick at it. And what I would say to somebody who was just starting law school, the thing I would say is, you actually want to get ahead of the game a little bit enough that you actually have time to practice taking some tests, because you do get better over it with time, right? And so you want to have some time to practice. I would also say that, trying to figure out what the right level of detail is hard, but you kind of have to realize that if you have a whole semester's worth of learning and you cram it into a 3-hour test at the end, you don't necessarily need to know every finite detail. You need to know, the thing you need to know most is how things work in the biggest, in the biggest sense. What are the biggest cogs on the machine and the most important cogs, and what makes the cogs turn? The finite detail might be the cherry on top of the frosting on the cake, but as far as making the cake goes, it's about the cogs, and learning how to kind of, like, these are bigger and more important ideas, and prioritizing kind of what you're going to learn is important. I'll tell you a time that I really failed to do this in law school. It was my very first semester, and the class I worked the hardest in, the one I was the most interested in my first semester, was a class called torts. Torts deals with harms inflicted by people on each other, not because they are malicious, but generally because they were sloppy or not careful. And I kind of, one of the things that law students do is they create outlines to basically figure out all the different rules. And I was just so prepared. Like, if the exam had been, tell me about the various rules that apply to nurses when they are in providing assistance to patients in an operation room. I had like some of the details down, right? Like, I knew about what the rules that were imputed to firefighters, and I thought about how different states thought about manufacturing defects. And I'd gotten so far down in the weeds that I kind of missed the forest for the trees, right? Like, if the test had been describe the tree, I was great, but the test was talk about the forest, and I was just, I had no idea. And so I struggled on that one for sure, even though I really put in the work, right? And so for me, I think a big part of what really makes a student stand out is getting students to focus kind of on what are the main things that I need to really get, and then really, really, really understand those rules. I mean, I think there's sort of, as far as triage goes, you don't know which part of the minutia the professor is going to pick up, but you can pretty much guarantee like what are the big cogs that I really need to know, and you can narrow it down and then really master those. So it's probably what I would say as a piece of advice, as far as being able to dissect problems quickly and well. That's probably the first skill I would point to.
That's awesome. Thank you. We have hit 10. We're a few minutes over, which is okay because we started a little bit late. Are there any other final questions that you want to ask before we say goodbye to Professor Daniels? Okay, cool. Well, Professor Daniels, Brig, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us today. It's been really cool hearing your perspective and just kind of learning more about your experience, and especially just getting to hear from one of the best professors I've had and one of the best professors at the law school. So we're really grateful for the time that you've taken today. And would it be all right if I send your contact information to interns in case they'd
please
like
do.
to follow up with you?
I would like that very much. If I can be helpful, let me know. I wish you all the very best. I'm just
likewise.
I'm so impressed with this group. This is a great group.
Well, thank you so much. We are impressed with you as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for the time taken today, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.